Hello, folks. My name is Brandon Bryce, and this is the America's Future Foundation TV coming to you. And today we're talking about a very important topic, criminal justice reform. And I've got three great guests today who are going to talk about it in the way that they actually address the issue. Below me, we've got Joseph Havman. He's with the Hope Network, and they talk about the work of how do they get people once they've served their time back into tax-paying citizenship and back to being citizens once again. To my direct right, your left, we've got a former deputy Detroit mayor, Anthony Adams, who's going to talk about the programs that he actually did when he was in that seat. And then diagonal across from me, Darrell Woods and his triumphant story of a man that has been there and back and wants to keep people from actually going in the first place. So I'm going to start this. I'll start to my direct right with Mr. Deputy Mayor. So Anthony Adams, I mean, why do we need criminal justice reform?
Because we've tried the mass incarceration rule, maximum sentencing, zero tolerance policies, and what we've ended up doing is spending billions of dollars to incarcerate men and women who could really be placed in a much more productive society. And so we've got to really transform what we do, how we do it, how we approach sentencing, how we approach actual interventions in order how we actually charge people with crimes, the discretion that officers use in order to put people in the system. How do we begin to change how we think about that to make it not a punitive system, but a system that is much more incorporating, much more inviting, much more transforming to the nature of the individuals who are being impacted by decisions that are made.
Joe, let me ask you this. Is criminal justice reform even possible in this political climate?
Well, I think it's one of the few things that is possible. I'm frustrated as can be about politics in this country and in this state, where politicians on both parties tend to work harder about winning something and making the other party look bad than they do about really solving problems. Criminal justice reform, though, has been successful in the past 10 years. It started slow when I was in the legislature. My first 2 years, I was looked at as kind of an oddball for the Republican Party, but it picked up steam. And you look at the things that have happened with clean slate, successor judge reform, the governor's task force on pre-sentencing jail reform. There's a lot of successes that have happened. And now we just have to continue that momentum. But no, it's one of the few things where we're actually achieving some things.
Darrell, let me ask you this. Two questions here. One, just your triumphant story as the man that can explain what happens inside and the out. Just talk about what kind of innovative practices are starting to happen from what you've seen as far as how are things getting better as it relates to prison reform and incarceration rates. Your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. Joe is spot on. Criminal justice reform is one of the most bipartisan issue in the country, by far. Republicans looking at the cost effective and as well as the humanity aspect of this as well. And then, Democrats, they are meeting together and they coming together and putting together common sense legislation. I met Joe in prison over a decade ago when he was in the legislature. I had life without the possibility of parole. I was condemned to die in prison. Joe, as a Republican, was out front leading the charge to reform the lifer laws, to reform the various truth in sentencing and the laws that was keeping us in bondage. Certainly, we wasn't getting a bang for our buck. And certainly we are not much safer, so he had the vision back then. And so it grew over the years because like-minded people came together and say, look, let's come put together some reforms. Right. And so on the inside, we were strong advocates. I was an 8th grade dropout when I went to prison. I got my GED, I got college education, I empowered myself in the work of civil rights. I was talking to Anthony before we got started. One of my mentors, Stan Sekou Nelson, who also had life without the possibility of parole, sat down and trained me.
Right.
And so inside the system, you have some men and women who are like political geniuses, legal geniuses. And so they was able to work with Joe Haveman. We were able to work with Joe Haveman and a number of legislators and leaders and present common sense solutions. And so it's just a matter of common sense and a morality to say that we're not going to allow ourselves to feed let's say for Michigan alone, feed $2 billion within the Michigan Department of Correction and don't get a good return on the investment, where we can use those dollars to be able to empower people with education and job opportunities, and the list goes on. So absolutely, this is a great climate.
Hold on. So speaking of jobs, and Deputy Mayor, I'm gonna come right to you. Speaking of job creation, it's no secret you could be Detroit's next mayor.
Yes.
How does this issue impact a city like Detroit?
I will be Detroit next mayor.
Okay. Nonpartisan. But let me ask this: how does this issue of criminal justice reform impact a city like Detroit, where we're seeing that poverty is a real conversation?
It is, but you're talking about a huge aspect of the budget. When you talk about money, the city of Detroit over the last 10 years has spent close to $4 billion in policing itself. The state of Michigan is spending $2 billion a year in incarcerating. That's a huge amount of money that's been spent when it's much more effective to utilize those dollars on the front end. It costs us $80,000 to incarcerate someone for a year, and we only spending $78 million a year in foundation allowance. You're stripping money out of the Department of Corrections budget, put it into much more in intervention programs because you need to begin to reduce the population. Because as Daryl said, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, as was my good friend Stan Nelson. And when you look at the transformation of what has occurred, in part because of the individuals involved, in part because of guys like Joe pushing on the other side to make things happen, it just makes so much sense that we should be able to accomplish so much more because we're spending way too much money to police ourselves versus try to address the underlying issue, because you can't address the issue of crime unless you address the issue of poverty. Poverty is tied directly to education. Education spending in Michigan is nowhere where it needs to be. We begin to shift those dollars in education, we have much more of a return on our dollar and making sure that people don't get caught up in the system.
Joe, let me ask you this. I mean, and you and I talked earlier about this when we talked about this whole sentencing reform. It's been proven that in some cases it is much cheaper to send someone to a 4-year college at an Ivy League school than to send them to prison. Your thoughts on this? Where do we go from here?
Well, a lot has happened, as I said. We've started to address the front end. We need to do more with our schools to make sure that kids that are prone to violent behavior, prone to crime, find an alternative. We're also doing a lot of good things on reentry after people are coming out. We're finding jobs for people. We realize that if we can get them back to work, get them into the system, the likelihood that they're going to go back is less. Michigan has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the country. We ought to be very proud of that. We still need to address the time that somebody spends in prison. Is it the right amount of time? Should it be lower? I believe Michigan is about 17 months longer than our neighboring states in the Midwest. So what are we getting for that 17 months? Are we getting an added sense of security? I doubt it. The most frustrating thing that I see when I go into prison are guys that are 60, 70, 80 and more. And typically there's not many left at past 80. But those life sentences where a guy is 60 years old and he did his crime 40 years ago,
right,
there's no return on investment there. He's aged out of his criminal behavior. He's paid his debt. Let's let him go home because he's not going to commit a crime again. And even if it's a violent crime, sometimes the more violent the crime was when a person was young, the lower the recidivism rate is for that crime. For somebody who commits a violent crime. So for heaven's sakes, let's show a degree of mercy and compassion and let them reunite with their families back in their communities and maybe teach a younger person something so he doesn't go in.
You know, Daryl, let me ask you this. You know, what role does a prosecutor, and this actually is, I want you to answer it, Daryl, but this is open to the group. What role does a prosecutor play in the sentencing of people when it comes to incarceration rates and criminal justice? Your thought. I mean, is it a large role? Is it a political role? What roles do the prosecution play?
It's both. A prosecutor has a lot of power and a lot of influence. So a prosecutor make recommendations based upon the sentencing guidelines. And if that prosecutor got a good relationship with the judge, that prosecutor might get what they want, So the thing is that I was a part of the team that helped remove the Oakland County prosecutor out of office because she was not compassionate, and she was a Democrat. She told herself she said she was a Democrat, whatever. But this woman, you had people who, with a United States Supreme Court, said that it was unconstitutional to sentence juvenile to life without the possibility of parole automatically. And so they had an opportunity to help fix the situation. So she took a stand and say that she had 44 juvenile lifers. She took the stand and say that I will continue to pursue life on 40 of those juvenile lifers and only get 4 opportunity. And what she had to find that these men and women were incorrigible and incapable of any type of transformation, in which it was impossible for her to do that without a hearing. But she took that stand. It was a hard stand, a bold stand. And so I said that was a judge that knew not God. And so, Kim Worthy, she came out the gate, allowing for juvenile lifers to get some relief, in Washtenaw County and other counties. But Jessica Cooper took a real hard knock stand, man, that was oppressive, and it was not conducive to the Supreme Court decision or a moral society on how you treat children.
Right. But I mean, there's always a political consideration that any prosecutor engages in any type of sentencing recommendation from their office. Obviously, you do have legislative guidelines which kind of define what Joe's talking about, which defines the length of the sentence. How does that fit in? How do you maybe reduce some of those lengths in those sentences in order to give less discretion to impose harsh and long sentences? And it really all turns on your belief in whether or not a man or a woman can be restored after they commit a criminal offense. I mean, that really is what we're really talking about here. If you believe that people who commit a violent crime don't deserve to see the light of day, then you have no value for their life. Because as the family would say, they didn't value my person's life, so why should I value their life? So there's a lot of value judgments. Prosecutors have broad discretion, but judges also have a great deal of discretion, and judges occasionally will deviate from sentencing guidelines if the defendant can make the appropriate case that the guidelines should be deviated from.
Joe, let me ask you this. Since you being a state rep, what moves has the legislature made to really get in the fight of prison reform? And have you seen it? Are you starting to see it more now than you did when you served?
Well, we dealt with, and Daryl talks about the juvenile life legislation that went through the Supreme Court. We dealt with that when I was there. And I continue to say it was one of the worst mistakes I made is voting yes on it, because we went right back and said, we took a recommendation from the Senate and said 25 to 45 years with a maximum of an outlier of 60. Well, that's in effect another life sentence. And we're left to the prosecutor like Jessica Cooper to say, okay, I'm willing to give on some of these. And I agree with Daryl. I mean, she was awful in her position. And Michigan is still lagging most states in being progressive on allowing those juveniles to have a second chance. So I feel like I made a mistake. We could have done much better when that Supreme Court decision came back and they said retroactivity was part of the juvenile life issue. The thing I'm really proud of, and it happened after I left, so I can't take credit for it, but the successor judge law that passed 2 years after I left, David Pagel from the St. Joe, Benton Harbor, that corner of the state, kind of picked up where I left off and got that bill through. And it said that we had a successor judge law that said that a judge who sat on the bench currently, but wasn't there when a crime or when a sentence was handed down, he still had the ability to veto the parole board. It didn't make any sense. That guy could have been in law school when a older judge handed down a sentence, but he still had the ability to veto the parole board. And we changed that. The legislature changed it after I left, and they said no more. That judge can make a recommendation, but he doesn't have veto power over the parole board. That allowed a lot of the elderly guys, the parole board, to have some discretion on them. So since I've left, like I said, clean slate. We are the only state in the nation right now with as expansive a law on clean slate. It's still being implemented. But what a fantastic thing we've done there, that when that's fully implemented, to allow people to clean their record. After 10 years, it's like the crime didn't exist. So no longer, now you're going to be middle-aged probably by the time you came out of prison, and then wait that time. But no longer will it show up on your record when you're applying for a mortgage or a job, or if you want to go back to school. Let's let people do their time and get them back into society and be productive and successful. I always say I want people paying the same taxes as me. I want them working just as hard as me. But hold on.
But here's the question now, gentlemen. And Joe, I want you to kick it off, and then I want you to answer, Daryl, and then you, Anthony. When you say that, it's going to be removed, now, how do we deal with, and this is just a general question, how do we deal with technology where if you have a case and it shows online, it's there. There is no more removing it from the internet. So how has the laws been able to counter those things as far as intellectual property? Your thoughts?
Well, first off, the law enforcement will always be able to see it, even after that. But that's why it's taking some time to implement. It's really a database kind of solution that companies will no longer be able to find it in a database. And as you could tell from me getting onto this StreamYard, I'm not the guy who talks about technology. But that's why it took so long too. That's the other reason why they had to figure this out, and the state has to implement new software to accommodate it, to really make that happen. But it's a step in the right direction where people are no longer have to check on their application that they've had a felony.
So Daryl, your thoughts as far as, now we're talking about, there has been myths and fears that, well, if they committed one crime, they'll commit another one. This whole conversation on, repeated offenders, is this a myth or is this something that's become politicized? Your thoughts?
It's been highly politicized in many ways. If you don't give the people the tools that they need to empower themselves to properly transition out of a hellhole, people who have been traumatized, people who have slept on a steel bunk, had to sit on a steel toilet, and be told what to do, move from prison to prison, can't see your family members, paying high telephone bills, children going through hell and high water. So they are absolutely traumatized. One thing with the Hope Network do, and Chance for Life and other organizations do, is make sure that they set things up to try to get counseling for the men and women who transition out. You know, they try to make sure that they have housing. They make sure that they have job opportunities and job training opportunities and other resources. And so again, don't nobody want to fish. I want to fish and rod. You know, so
Anthony, let me ask you this. You know, right now the conversation is really around drug policy, which probably plays a big role when we talk about the number of people being incarcerated.
Right.
What can cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and New Orleans do to counter those people who may have more so addictions than criminal behavior?
Right. Well, I mean, so the first thing you have to do is you have to start decriminalizing possession of small amounts of all drugs, whether it's heroin, whether it's cocaine. You know, I mean, obviously marijuana is legal now, whether pills. We need to decriminalize that because it is an issue related to an illness versus a crime. And if I give you the opportunity now also, but there is a movement out there because I've actually talked to a group of people who actually believe that drug use is not bad for you. That they actually believe that people should be able to take certain drugs if they want to. And it's not an illness. So I mean, there's an issue around that. But at the end of the day, if you begin to decriminalize possession of small amounts of drugs, a police officer makes a stop. He finds a small possession of drugs on the person. It really shouldn't be handled as a criminal citation. Maybe it's some type of administrative citation. They have a hearing. There's some type of proceeding where you given the option of getting treatment or not, or explaining exactly what you want to do. There's some things that cities can do to lessen the burden at the front end on the officers, because that takes the officers off the street for something that really is not necessarily a crime, because oftentimes 99% of the time it's a consensual conduct on the part of the party who has the drugs. And so you can begin to decriminalize that, take it away. And you can do it with drugs. You can do it, for example, with prostitution. Obviously, if it's not sex trafficking per se, but just pure consensual adults consenting to have sex, why is that a crime? Why should it be? So you begin to take things off the books, that you change the laws, you change the enforcement, and then you're able to move in a much different direction. It lessens the burden on the criminal justice system, and it gives people the option, if they want to get treatment, to move into a treatment modality. So there's some things that definitely can be done at the city level.
Joe, let me ask you this. You know, when they say that, you know, studies have shown that more than 70% of state prisons are comprised of Black and brown individuals. We know that all people commit crimes, regardless of race, gender, whatever. Let me ask you this. Why do you think, realistically, that is the case, where literally the prison system is more than half representing of Black and brown individuals throughout the nation?
You know, I'm going to confess, I'm probably the least qualified guy here to talk about that. I'm a white guy from West Michigan, talking to a Detroit audience.
Actually, you're talking to the nation.
Okay. Personally, I believe that we have a national problem, and I've resisted trying to make it a race issue. We are the most incarcerated country in the world. And yes, there are disparities. But I think if we deal with this as a criminal justice problem, minorities are going to be disproportionately benefited, as they have been disproportionately penalized. So I would rather, I know, especially after 2020, race is such an important issue in this country. But I would rather deal with it as a criminal justice problem for the whole nation and the state, and try to keep race out of it. I think it's a problem for everyone.
See, I don't think we can avoid the impact of race, because it's been so embedded in the system in terms of how things occur, the structure of justice, the fact that Black and brown men were denied educational opportunities, which suppressed their ability to make a living and earning. I mean, there's a lot of race implications involved in the incarceration movement. Obviously, the move towards mandatory minimums of criminal justice, enforcement, vigorous enforcement, impacted disparities in treatment and sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. So there's a racial bias that's already built into the system. We can't we can't ignore it, because I think if we ignore it, we lose sight on what we really have to do and what we really have to change. There is some component of it that appears to be benign, but when you look at its impact and its disproportionate impact on African Americans and Brown, then we have to take that into consideration as part of the equation for how we're going to fix the problem as well.
Joe, did you want to respond to that, Joe? You're muted.
Absolutely.
There we go. Go ahead.
You want to chime in first, Joe, before I say
Joe,
something?
did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, if I could, please. Anthony, I don't discount anything you're saying. And like I said, I am probably the least qualified to speak about that. The example you used about the difference between crack and powder cocaine, that's common knowledge for people that have paid attention to this, the disparity in sentencing. So I don't disagree with you at all. I think it isn't important. I think we would be more effective in dealing with mass incarceration if we dealt with it independent of the race issue. So I don't want to disagree with you. I just feel like I was hoping that we could keep race out of it. I agree with you that it's probably too late for that.
Hold that thought. Daryl, you wanted to respond as someone who has actually heard the stories and talked to people who have been incarcerated. Your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. They said the journey of 1,000 miles begin with one step. So we got to make the leap of faith and make that step to say that, okay, we identified this problem. So how we get there, I don't care about it as long as we dismantle this system of mass incarceration. Absolutely, if you do the historical research, you would see why did they make cocaine illegal? Why did they create prisons? Go Google on PBS. They got documentaries on it, and this is just universal knowledge. You go into Plessy versus Ferguson and all these historical cases. You're gonna see that race is the foundation of the building of the criminal justice system. And if you go with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and some of the things why did they create some of the laws that they did, it's crystal clear. But how we solve this problem, I don't care how we solve it, as long as we solve it. And I think that we can come together and put our minds together. We might have differences. I'm not a Republican. I don't know if I'm a Democrat either. You know what I'm saying? I sometimes I say I'm a Jesus-crat. But let it be clear. Let it be absolutely clear. My passion and my desire is to be able to help those men and women be free from the system of oppression that is in the Michigan Department of Corrections right now. COVID exposed us. COVID-19 exposed us. It was man's inhumanity to man in there, where you had over 20-something thousand people who contracted COVID-19. And in the midst of that, you had hundreds of deaths. It took a long time to just get face masks to the people and for them to put hand sanitizer machines in there. We could have did something humane in that situation, and we can continue. We can do it now, because that system during COVID-19 was gut wrenching. I have friends who died in there. People who have paroles. People have paroles on deck. They said they was good enough to have a parole, but you couldn't expedite that, find a way to expedite that, to say, okay, let's put them on house arrest or do something different instead of keep them in there exposed to that virus and to be able to die in there. It was a guy who was a juvenile lifer who had over 40 years in there, and he died just prior to him getting out of COVID-19. I knew a guy who had no legs, no arms. Why do we have a man in there like that? Women dying in there, people that's totally blind, so, that's something that we need to look at. We need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what are we doing? We got to have compassion. The recidivism rate for those who have life sentences that got out who had life sentences and got out and got released is less than 1%. It's less than 1%. And still we're going to sit up there and allow our taxpayer dollars to allow people to sit in prison and die and be tormented by viruses and other illnesses. Many got cancer and all type of ailments. You go into the geriatric unit in the prison system in Coldwater, Michigan, you'll fall out.
Hold that thought, because I want Anthony and Joe to answer this question around criminal justice reform. What is the impact of COVID-19 on criminal justice reform? Start with Anthony.
So what it did was it recognized that we have a lot of people who are incarcerated who shouldn't be in jail. Compassionate releases, COVID releases, released into the population. A lot of people who really, they had served sentences. I've known guys who had kingpin sentences, 25 years reduced, 10 years, 12 years. And they're out, they're released, and they appear to be doing quite well. So, really recognize that we incarcerate people for far too long, and we need to really begin to look at how we can use that whole compassion movement to pardon and release people. That's sort of like at the back end of the criminal justice reform issue. We still have to address much more at the front end. And so when you look at how you make these changes, you make decisions on releasing people based on the COVID and the virus, well, we have to recognize if you have those powers to do that, why are we not doing more of that as a part of the toolkit? Because they're always balancing punishment versus rehabilitation. Societies need to have people punished for their crime, and yet a recognition that a person has done things necessary to allow them to be re-entered back into society, as Gerald talked about.
Joe, let me ask you this. In addition to the question on COVID-19 and its impact on criminal justice reform, can you talk about the relationship between criminal justice reform and economic development?
Oh, I'd love to. First on COVID, I think we missed a golden opportunity. We could have used COVID as the reason to expedite releases. We could have increased our paroles. We could have looked at compassionate releases. Because, if you visited, you know that it's not always 2 men to a cell or 1 man to a cell. Sometimes it's 8 people in a little bunkhouse, 8 people in what about the size of what my college dorm was 40 years ago, and 8 guys. So you can't practice 6-foot distancing. It's just not practical. So decreasing our population for the most vulnerable would have been the first step I think we should have taken. Our parole board should have said, okay, let's look at age, let's look at health, let's look at crime and how far they are into their sentence, and let's make some compassionate releases. So, yeah. Economic development, well, our population is not growing the way it used to. We're not having enough kids per family to really forecast our economic growth into the future. Our workforce development is so critical that we plan for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Are we going to have a workforce there to do the jobs that are here now? The jobs are going to change. We know that, I'll long be retired, but jobs will change. They continually do. But we're not having enough kids in the system now to create that workforce. Before COVID, on the west side of Michigan, we had an unemployment rate about 3% in my hometown. Everyone was looking for employees. Well, that's one reason the recidivism rate went down. That's one reason why prison reform for those coming out was successful, is the workforce would accept them. 15 years ago, resumes, if they saw that you had a felony, it'd go right in the wastebasket. 5 years ago, things changed and people were being hired. My point is that we need to cultivate a culture that says we need you in the job. We need you working. It's good for the parolee. It's good for a person coming out to be able to get a job right away, but it's also good for our economy. And that's the way I tried to sell it when I go out and speak is, hey, our faith says that you know, people need a second chance and we have to look after the least of these among us. But also, this is just good business. So it's been successful in West Michigan. And frankly, if I can give a plug to Hope Network, we have a program in Grand Rapids called Hope Network Industries, where we run a packaging plant. We take a lot of people out of jail and prison and give them that first job that doesn't require a lot of skills. We want to take that same program and duplicate it in Wayne County. We know that there's more people coming back to Wayne County from when they're released. We want to create a system, workforce job program that would help these guys when they first come out. We've got the experience with Hope Network Industries. There, I gave my shameless plug for who I work for. Love to talk to you guys more about that offline.
Daryl, let me ask you this. What role does the faith-based communities play in criminal justice reform? I mean, there are some people who say that, you know, maybe there needs to be more faith-based programs and more skilled trade programs in the prison system before they come out. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. The faith-based community play a vital role in the transformation of the prison system. It's actually the faith-based community that bring hope, no pun intended, inside the prison. I'm a young man. I got saved and born again inside prison. You know, I gave my life to Christ. You know, people say people go to prison and run to Christ. If you get life without the possibility of parole and be told you're gonna die in prison, who you gonna call on? The devil? You know, so I called on the Lord, and he was able to rescue me. You know, and so this is it was the faith-based community that was able to work with me, to be able to mentor me, as well as the civil rights community. You know, the NAACP was very, very good to me. You know, the Detroit branch of the NAACP under Reverend Wendell Anthony. We served under his leadership for years, you know, but it was my church, Joe Haveman, 70 times 7, his former pastor up there in Western Michigan, coming down from Western Michigan down to the Ryan Correctional Facility, and Jim Lisk came down and ministered with us. You know, he was over Prison Fellowship. Denise Harris, who was the field director for Prison Fellowship, Bishop Edgar Van, Bishop Marvin Winans, all these pastors came in to be able to minister to the people. It was Reverend Kenneth Flowers who led the charge to get me freed from prison. You know, because he went before Governor Snyder on numerous occasions on my behalf, and to be able to uplift my name. You know, so he put some action behind his faith. He didn't just want to just pray for me. He said, "Look, man, I'm going to advocate for you." You know, my pastor, Bishop Charles Ellis, came in there on a regular basis to be able to minister, you know, and to be able to bring some inspiration, bring some food in there, they did all kinds of things to be able to bless. So even when you transition out of there, you need that mentorship and these things that the faith-based community can continue to build upon. But if we can unify these, this community, the faith-based community, to be able to say, hey, one finger can do little harm, but all the fingers together can strike a mighty blow. You know, so we need to put our hands around a Hope Network who want to build an industry in the city of Detroit for returning citizens, because we need more jobs. You know, we need more opportunity. So absolutely, the faith-based community I take my hat off to them. And to me, I told somebody this: the church is the most powerful institution in the world. Yeah. I don't care. It's imperfect. It ain't saintly all the time, but I guarantee you that it make things happen.
Anthony, let me ask you this. I mean,
we always aspire to a higher goal in our spiritual beliefs.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this, because you have been literally the second man in control to a major city.
Right.
What are the numbers, and are the actual incidents actually being reported to the police, or is there a disparity there of what's a crime versus what can be an alternative measure? I mean, Are we doing enough to deter criminal activity in a place like Detroit or in a state like Michigan?
No, because if you rely upon law enforcement to deal with poverty and crime, you're not going to ever solve the problem. You have to begin to fundamentally address the issue of crime, of poverty, because of its impact on crime. Because most crimes, a lot of crime is tied to poverty, hopelessness, helplessness, the inability of people to get meaningful jobs because they have bad education. That's what I begin to talk more about: front-end intervention strategies. How do we divert people? How do we change behavior? How do we enhance, encourage other things? How do we promote different skill sets so that people have opportunities? If you don't want to go to college, then maybe you should be in a skilled trade. Maybe you should be doing something else. How do we put people in their lane so that they're comfortable in doing what they want to do to reduce the impact of crime in our society? Because we're not going to get to it by putting the police on every corner. We'll get to it, I think, much more effective in understanding the impact of education, understanding the impact of housing insecurity, homelessness, and helplessness on the issue of crime, to address those issues, and then have much more aggressive intervention strategies in terms of hiring what I would say community intervention specialists. You know, they have a lot of programs in Detroit where they have, ceasefire, mother save your sons and things of that nature that are much more proactive, but they aren't funded to the level, from my perspective, that they need to be funded in order to be effective and put more resources and bodies out in the community. We have to invest in people. If we're investing and spending our money in people, then we have Darrell Woods, we have Stan Nelsons who are able to come back because they have a full array of services to assist them, not only before they get in trouble, but if they get in trouble, then there's a transition plan for how we move people back into society. Because as Joe says, we don't have people to staff the jobs now that we have in our own economy.
Joe, let me ask you this. I mean, right now, and you kind of alluded to it before, on the national level, where is Michigan in terms of at least being progressive on these issues? I know states like Missouri have really taken the task to say, how do we fix this problem? Other states, not so much. How would you grade, if you could, a letter, A through F, on is the state of Michigan moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? And if not, why?
I would give us a B. I know that Texas was working on it. They achieved a lot of goals 5 years ago or so. They were probably ahead of them. But over the past 4 years, and it really did start after I left the legislature, there was a period there where people were willing to say, okay, it was Snyder's last 4 years. I was with Rick Snyder as governor his first 4 years. His second 4 years, there was more momentum. So we've done well. If you really look at Michigan, in 2007 had over 51,000 prisoners. That was the high point. Now, Governor Granholm, I'll give her a little credit. She released a lot of people. There was a program that she started that we're still kind of continuing today, and the name escapes me, but it's changed.
MPRI.
It's really MPRI. Thank you.
MPRI,
It's led
okay.
to the re-entry program that we have today. It could always be better, but Michigan has been very progressive. Now, as I said, the low-hanging fruit for me is the elderly in prison. Why in the world are we investing so much in people at the tail end of their lives, in their healthcare cost, when we could just send them back home, reacquaint them with their families, let them get to know their grandchildren, and allow Medicaid to pay at least a portion of their health care? It's to me, it's a no-brainer, because okay, they've created or they committed heinous crimes, but let's find it in our hearts to say, you're better off on the outside, and we're better off for having you on the outside. You've learned your lesson. Now go teach a young person how not to make those same mistakes. So from a cost perspective, it's the right thing to do. From a moral perspective, it's the right thing to do. And that's I think the next hill we have to climb.
Now, Anthony, I saw you cheesing. Was there something? What was it that Joe said that sparked you? I saw something, the light go off.
No, I just think that, I actually think the state should get. I'm gonna give them an A minus. I'm gonna give them an A minus because the governor had the commission with Garland Gilchrist when we worked with the Supreme Court. They came up with a lot of recommendations, new recommendations about cash bail systems, how things are done. The legislation has been passed for the Clean Slate Initiative. There's a lot of momentum. Now we've got to really push the funding level. The Michigan Department of Corrections begin to move more money out of actual incarceration and into prisoner reentry, into more intervention. So I'm actually going to give them a much higher grade than Joe, because I think that we just got to keep pushing the envelope to make sure that we can get that. At least we can get an A. We got to get an A. We get to an A. Daryl's happy. I'm happy. Joe's happy. We've got a lot of workers. People have been retrained, and we reduced our crime rate because we're investing on the front end, in the middle, and the back end on people to believing that they can change their ways.
Daryl, I have a question for you. I mean, as someone who's been through the system, do you have one story of kind of a person who maybe you served time with that inspired you, or someone that you heard their story and you said, you know what, I've got to change my life? Do you have just that one story?
Oh, absolutely. It's the gentleman that Anthony talked about, Stan Sekou Nelson. And this is not just his story, but this is the story of hundreds of people that's remained still in the Michigan Department of Corrections, men and women. Stan was in prison under the antiquated felony murder law. That law was abolished in 1980. Said it was unconstitutional by the Michigan Supreme Court. They didn't make it retroactive. So now you have these men and women in prison under a law that don't longer exist, and doing life without the possibility of parole. So now Stan fought for years and years and years. When I was able to meet him, I was a teenager, and he was able to pull me to the side, talk with me, made sure that I was a part of the birth of the NAACP at the Ryan Correctional Facility. So we started that organization. We started a youth program called the Youth Deterrent Program, which judges sentence young people to. Our program is affectionately known as Carriage Straight, and it's now in 5 different prisons now. So this man inspired me to no end. He taught me the law. Mike Steinberg was one of my law professors. Many of the federal judges were my law professors. Stan was my law professor. Yeah. I can shepherdize just as good as Anthony Adams.
Just so charge my rate, okay?
I need to charge a rate because I think I probably wrote some good briefs before in my life, And so I was deeply inspired by Stan. Stan fought for his freedom. Reverend Anthony, Hester Willer, Kwame Kilpatrick, and a number of people put their arms around him and gave Stan an opportunity. With the prosecutor at the time was Mike Duggan. They went to Mike Duggan, and Mike Duggan had mercy on Stan. And Stan got out in 2003. And Stan is the owner and operator of Red Rose Flower Shop, downtown Detroit. And is a very inspirational leader, and he has helped thousands of people on the inside. So that's that one story. But again, let's not forget though about those men and women who are condemned to die in prison under a law that don't exist anymore. Right. And we can commute their sentences. We can do some things to get these men and women out of the system. Many of them have done over 40 years in prison, 40, 45 years, 50 years in prison. I had to eulogize a gentleman who did 41 years in prison under that law. His mom was still alive, 92 years old. I told her I would never forget her son dying in there under a law that no longer exists.
Right. Gentlemen, we are coming down to the end of the program. Just want to do a couple of last minute responses. Final thoughts. I'll go start with Joe, then we'll go to Anthony. Then Daryl, you'll close us out. Final thoughts, and where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? We've got to we've got to tie this to the economy. We've got to look at our workforce in the next years and say, how do we get people back re-educated? And how do we start taking some of these prisons that are offline now and find that savings and reinvest it back to our young people to keep them from going into the system.
Right.
And then secondly, I would say it was talked about, but the churches play an incredible role here. And this, West Michigan has done a really good job with its churches reaching out and accepting men back in to the community. It's been led by the church. Daryl talked about that. I don't know if that's happening in the Detroit area, but if it's not, in Oakland County, in other counties, it's got to be church led. And I think that is so important. And all the things that you talk about, Daryl went into all the people that he met going into Ryan and helping and teaching and counseling. So Daryl was a better prisoner for that. But all those people that went in were better off too. When you give yourself, whether it's through your church or personally, and spend time within these prisons, I'm a better person because of the work I did years ago, going in once a week, Sunday nights to prisons. I walked out of there more blessed than when I walked in. And I hope people can recognize the dual benefit of helping these.
Anthony, final thoughts.
We still got work to do. We're not at the finish line yet. We've got to understand that in order to attack issues of crime, we have to address the issue of poverty. We've got to be much more intentional on the front end to make sure that we don't put people in the system. When we had the opportunity to put people in the system, we didn't have to begin to exercise discretion to determine whether or not that offense should be charged. How do we begin to decriminalize conduct, which takes up a lot of resources and effort and time of officers to put people in administrative situations so they don't necessarily have to deal with a criminal case? How do we then move from people that are in the system? How do we re-enter them into our population? How do we change our sentencing structure to perhaps reduce sentencing because we see now that people with long sentences tend not to commit crimes. And so while we're not beginning to move people out of the system, we have to recognize, however, that a major industry in Michigan was developed around the prison system. And a lot of small cities will be impacted by this decision. So what's the strategy to help retrain the people who are in those cities as the same part of the whole approach to what we have to do? So there are a lot of things we have to balance, keep moving forward. And remember that as long as we invest in people, I think we get a much better return for our investment.
And finally, Daryl, final thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brandon and Anthony and Joe for the conversation. I believe that we have to really look at commutation in this state. As Joe said, Granholm commuted more sentences than any governor in history. There were no problems. You know, when you have men and women trapped in that situation, then we have to use every method possible. I'm very, very appreciative that, you know, I got commuted by Governor Snyder and Granholm. Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She appointed me to the State Appellate Defenders Commission. So, you know, I'm able to sit down and look at policy. You know, in the heat of the protests, when everything was going on, my friend Teferi Brandt, Next Vu and that team, we came together and said we didn't want to just be protesters, but we wanted to be policy changers. So, you know, we went to protests, and spoke out against some things. But in the same token, we sat down with over 8 police chiefs thus far, and sat down and went over their use of force policies to see are in compliance with 8 can't wait. And then also another thing we need to look at in the criminal justice system is the conviction integrity units. When you have men and women who were literally kidnapped by their state or by their city or by the government and placed in prison for something that they had no idea happened and given life sentences. So we got to make sure that we got the proper funding in the conviction integrity unit to make sure that we get every man and woman that we possibly can get out of there that who is actually innocent. And we make sure that we compensate them properly, that compensation fund don't run out because we owe them. Yeah. Because we took their lives from them, you know, and we, in some cases, because of gross police misconduct, officers committed perjury, planted evidence, and just lied in the case. And you got men and women who had to suffer man's inhumanity to man based upon that. And so we need to do something about that. And so there's so much room for growth. So the grade I give an A+ for the Clean Slate Act, but I give a grade of incomplete until we continue to get more done.
And that closes us out, folks. This is another episode of americasfuture.org. I'm your host, Brandon Bryce. This has been a conversation on criminal justice reform. I want to thank my guests, former Deputy Mayor Anthony Adams, Darrell Woods, and former State Representative Joseph Haffman. Gentlemen, your work will not go in vain. Folks, that's all. As we say, good night and Godspeed.